What if the fate of an entire ocean and the empires on both sides of it had been decided not by war alone, but by diplomacy, betrayal, idealism, and sheer geopolitical necessity? Spain and the United States share one of history's most turbulent, layered, and consequential transatlantic relationships. From the days when Spanish galleons ruled the Atlantic to the moment a young American republic inherited the last remnants of a dying Spanish empire. This is a story of collision and cooperation, pride and pragmatism, revolution and reconciliation. This is the hidden history of Spain and the United States in transatlantic politics, and nothing about it is simple. The Atlantic Divide, Spain's empire and the birth of a rival, 1492 to 1800. Long before the United States existed, Spain owned the Atlantic. In the late 15th century, when Christopher Columbus sailed westward under the Castilian crown and made landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, he set in motion the most dramatic imperial project the Western world had ever seen. Within decades, Spain controlled territories stretching from the tip of South America to the Gulf of Mexico, from the silver mines of Potosi to the plazas of Cuba and Hispaniola. The Atlantic Ocean was not a barrier for Spain. It was a highway, a lifeline, a river of silver and spice flowing back to the Iberian Peninsula. The Casa de Contratación in Seville regulated all colonial trade with an iron grip. Spanish galleons, heavy and slow but bristling with cannon, carried the treasures of the New World across 3,000 miles of open sea. Spain was, without exaggeration, the first true Atlantic superpower. For nearly 2 centuries, this dominance went largely unchallenged. England, France, and the Netherlands nibbled at the edges, pirating Spanish ships, planting small colonies on islands Madrid considered its own, but the Spanish Empire held. Then, in the 17th century, cracks began to appear. Military overextension, the cost of wars across Europe, the draining of New World silver into continental conflicts, the decline of the Habsburg dynasty. All of these forces slowly eroded Spain's Atlantic supremacy. By the early 18th century, Spain had passed to the Bourbon dynasty through the War of the Spanish Succession, and under the Bourbons, Madrid undertook sweeping reforms designed to reassert imperial control. The Bourbon reforms restructured colonial administration, tightened trade regulations, expanded the military presence in the Americas, and attempted to bind the colonies more firmly to the mother country. These reforms were, in retrospect, too late and too rigid. They alienated powerful Creole elites in Spanish America who had grown accustomed to significant local autonomy. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, something unprecedented was taking shape in the British colonies of North America. By the 1760s, tensions between London and its American colonies had reached a breaking point. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, had ended in 1763 with Britain triumphant and France stripped of its North American empire. But the financial cost of that war led London to impose new taxes on the colonies, provoking fierce resistance. Spain watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. Satisfaction, because a weakened Britain served Spanish interests. Anxiety, because a successful colonial rebellion against a European mother country could inspire dangerous ideas among Spain's own colonies. When the American Revolutionary War erupted in 1775, Spain faced a profound dilemma. Madrid had no desire to see a republic of self-governing colonists succeed. Such a precedent was an existential threat to empire itself. And yet, Britain was Spain's primary imperial rival. The enemy of one's enemy, as the old logic goes, could be useful. In 1779, Spain entered the war against Britain, but but it did so as an ally of France rather than a direct ally of the American revolutionaries. This was a crucial distinction. Spain never formally recognized the United States during the Revolutionary War. It supported the American cause financially and militarily. Spanish forces under Governor Bernardo de Galvez brilliantly captured British strongholds along the Gulf of Mexico, including Pensacola in 1781, but Madrid was deeply uncomfortable with the ideological implications of American independence. The Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the Revolutionary War, returned Florida to Spain and confirmed Spain's hold on Louisiana. The Spanish Empire, for the moment, remained intact, but the new United States sat directly along Spain's northern colonial frontier, and relations between the two countries were already complicated. American settlers were pushing westward and southward towards Spanish-controlled territory. Spanish officials in Louisiana and Florida tried to slow this expansion through a combination of trade restrictions, frontier diplomacy, and by encouraging Native American resistance to American encroachment. Americans, for their part, resented Spanish control of the lower Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, through which Western agricultural goods had to flow to reach Atlantic markets. The stage was set for a relationship defined by geographic intimacy and political tension. Two nations sharing a continent while disagreeing fundamentally about how that continent should be organized and governed. The 1795 Treaty of San Lorenzo, also known as Pinckney's Treaty, momentarily eased these tensions. Spain granted the United States navigation rights on the Mississippi and the right of deposit at New Orleans. It also resolved border disputes in the Southeast. But the underlying competition for continental dominance was not resolved. It was merely paused. And as the 18th century drew to a close, both nations were about to be transformed by events neither could fully control. The French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the shockwaves these sent through the Atlantic world would reshape the relationship between Spain and the United States in ways no diplomat of 1795 could have foreseen. By the turn of the 19th century, Spain's empire was under pressure from every direction. Napoleon's armies were moving through Europe. British naval power threatened Spanish Atlantic communications. Creole elites in the Americas were increasingly restless, and the young United States, still fragile but already ambitious, was watching the slow unraveling of Spanish imperial power with intense interest. The transatlantic relationship between these two nations was about to enter its most dramatic phase. The Louisiana Question and the Collapse of Empire, 1800 to 1821. The year 1800 changed everything. In the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain ceded Louisiana back to France, not to a weakened revolutionary France, but to a France now dominated by Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose continental ambitions knew no limit. For Spain, this was a desperate gamble, a bid to place a powerful buffer between its remaining North American colonies and the relentlessly expanding United States. For the United States, the news was alarming. The prospect of Napoleonic France sitting astride the Mississippi River and controlling New Orleans was far more threatening than the presence of a declining Spain. President Thomas Jefferson, normally inclined toward France and suspicious of commercial empire, grasped the strategic reality immediately. He instructed his ambassador to Paris, Robert Livingston, to explore the purchase of New Orleans. What happened next stunned even Jefferson. Napoleon, facing renewed war with Britain and the catastrophic collapse of his Caribbean ambitions after the Haitian Revolution, in which enslaved people destroyed an entire French army and proclaimed independence, decided that his American empire was a liability. In 1803, France offered to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. Jefferson accepted, With the stroke of a pen, the United States doubled in size and pushed its frontier to the Rocky Mountains. For Spain, this was a geopolitical disaster of the first order. American settlers now sat on the borders of Texas, New Mexico, and California. The buffer that San Ildefonso was supposed to create had instead been sold away by the very power Spain had trusted. Spanish officials in the Americas tried to slow what now seemed like an inevitable American tide. Texas became a zone of friction almost immediately. American filibustering expeditions, unauthorized military incursions by private citizens, probed Spanish territory in Texas and Florida. Spain struggled to defend borders that stretched for thousands of miles with military forces that were chronically underfunded and stretched thin. In Florida, the situation was particularly dire. East and West Florida remained in Spanish hands, but the provinces were effectively ungovernable. Runaway American slaves sought refuge there under Spanish protection. Creek and Seminole warriors, displaced by American expansion northward, used Florida as a base. American settlers from Georgia constantly crossed the border illegally. Then came the War of 1812, which further scrambled the strategic situation. Britain and the United States went to war, and Spain, allied with Britain against Napoleon, found itself in the peculiar position of being nominally on the same side as the United States against France, while simultaneously competing with the United States for North American territory. The complexities were dizzying. After Napoleon's defeat in the Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815, Spain briefly hoped to reassert itself. But its American colonies were in open revolt. The Spanish-American Wars of Independence, ignited in part by the ideological example of the United States and the French Revolution, were consuming the empire from within. By 1820, Spain had effectively lost Mexico, the Rio de la Plata, Argentina, and was losing control everywhere. Florida became the flashpoint that forced a resolution. In 1817 to 1818, General Andrew Jackson led American forces into Spanish Florida in pursuit of Seminole warriors and runaway slaves, an unauthorized invasion of sovereign Spanish territory that caused outrage in Madrid. Jackson captured Spanish forts, executed 2 British subjects he accused of aiding the Seminoles, and effectively demonstrated that Spain could not defend Florida. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, a cold-eyed strategist of extraordinary ability, used Jackson's invasion as leverage. Rather than apologizing to Spain, Adams defended Jackson's actions and made clear that if Spain could not police its own territory, the United States would do it for them. This was diplomatic pressure of a brutal and effective kind. The result was the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, also known as the Transcontinental Treaty. Spain ceded Florida to the United States entirely, renounced all claims north of the 42nd parallel on the Pacific coast, and in exchange the United States assumed $5 million in claims American citizens had against Spain. The treaty also defined the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase all the way to the Pacific for the first time, giving the United States a transcontinental claim. For Spain, the treaty was a painful but perhaps realistic concession. Florida was effectively already lost, and settling the boundary question provided some clarity in an otherwise collapsing situation. Within 2 years of the Adams-Onis Treaty, Spain had lost Mexico, Central America, and most of South America. The empire that had once stretched from Manila to Mexico City, from Buenos Aires to the Gulf of California, was reduced to Cuba, Puerto Rico, a few Pacific islands, and fragments of Africa. The transatlantic relationship between Spain and the United States had been fundamentally reordered. Spain was no longer a continental rival. It was a diminished power clinging to Caribbean islands while watching the Republic to its north continue to expand in size and ambition. The Cuban question and the road to 1898, 1823 to 1898. With its continental empire gone, Spain clung to Cuba with a ferocity born of desperation and pride. Cuba was not merely a colony. It was the pearl of the Antilles, the most valuable piece of territory Spain still possessed in the Western Hemisphere. The island's sugar economy, built on enslaved African labor, generated enormous wealth. Havana was one of the great cities of the Atlantic world, and Cuba was strategically positioned at the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico, commanding the sea lanes that connected the United States to its own expanding interests. For all of these reasons, Cuba became the central obsession of Spanish-American transatlantic politics for the entire 19th century. American interest in Cuba was nearly as old as American independence itself. Thomas Jefferson had mused about Cuba as a natural addition to the United States. John Quincy Adams, in a famous letter written while he was Secretary of State, described Cuba as a ripe fruit that must eventually fall by the laws of political gravity into the hands of the United States. The question was not whether the United States wanted Cuba. It transparently did, but whether it would obtain the island through purchase, conquest, or by waiting for Spanish power to collapse entirely. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 added a new dimension to the transatlantic equation. President James Monroe, with Secretary of State Adams as the doctrine's primary architect, declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization and that any attempt by European powers to extend their system to the Americas would be considered a threat to American peace and safety. The doctrine was, in practical terms, a statement of American hegemonic ambition. It did not apply retroactively to existing colonies. Spain's Cuba was not immediately threatened, but it established the conceptual framework within which American policymakers would increasingly view Spanish Caribbean power as fundamentally illegitimate. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s, the Cuban question became entangled with American domestic politics in the most toxic way. Southern slaveholders looked at Cuba and saw the potential for new slave territory that could strengthen the South's position in the sectional conflict over slavery's expansion. Multiple American administrations made offers to purchase Cuba from Spain. In 1848, President James K. Polk offered $100 million. In 1854, the Ostend Manifesto, written by American diplomats abroad, brazenly argued that if Spain refused to sell Cuba, the United States would be justified in seizing it by force. Spain refused every overture with indignation. Cuba was not for sale. Its loss would be a national humiliation of the deepest kind. In Cuba itself, independence sentiment grew throughout the 19th century. In 1868, Cuban rebels led by Carlos Manuel de Céspedes launched the 10 Years' War against Spanish rule, the first of three great independence struggles. The insurrection was eventually crushed, but it exposed the fragility of Spain's hold. Spanish military response was brutal. Torture, summary executions, the destruction of property, and it generated international criticism. The United States government officially remained neutral during the 10 Years' War, but American public opinion was broadly sympathetic to the Cuban rebels, and American citizens provided money, weapons, and volunteers to the independence cause. These private interventions infuriated Madrid and added to the accumulating tensions. The Second Cuban Uprising came in 1895, led by the poet and revolutionary José Martí, who had spent years organizing the independence movement from exile in the United States. Martí was killed in battle within weeks of returning to Cuba, but the rebellion he ignited could not be extinguished. Spain's response was to send General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba with orders to end the insurrection by any means necessary. Weyler instituted the infamous reconcentration policy, herding Cuba's rural population into fortified camps to deny the rebels their civilian support base. The camps became death traps. Disease and starvation killed tens of thousands of Cuban civilians. American newspapers, particularly the papers of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, locked in fierce circulation competition, covered the Cuban atrocities in vivid, often sensationalized detail. Public outrage in the United States reached a fever pitch. By 1898, the United States was teetering on the edge of war with Spain. President William McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana Harbor in January 1898, officially to protect American citizens and commercial interests. On February 15, 1898, the Maine exploded and sank, killing 266 American sailors. The cause of the explosion has never been definitively established. Spanish sabotage, an internal accident, or an external mine are all possibilities that historians continue to debate, but the American press and public immediately blamed Spain. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became the rallying cry of a nation moving toward war. McKinley, under enormous political pressure, asked Congress for authorization to use military force. Congress obliged, declaring war on April 25, 1898. The Spanish-American War of 1898 lasted less than 4 months. American naval forces under Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay in the Philippines on May 1, 1898, in a battle that lasted roughly 7 hours. American forces landed in Cuba and fought a series of engagements that, while not without difficulty, ended in American victory. The Spanish Caribbean fleet was destroyed in the Battle of Santiago de Cuba on July 3, 1898. Spain, exhausted and outgunned, sued for peace. From Empire's End to Atlantic Partnership, 1898, present. The Treaty of Paris of 1898, signed by Spain and the United States in December, after negotiations that excluded the Cuban, Puerto Rican, Filipino, and Guamanian peoples most directly affected, transferred Spain's last major overseas empire to the United States. Cuba became nominally independent under American supervision. Puerto Rico and Guam became American territories outright. The Philippines were purchased by the United States from Spain for $20 million, setting in motion an American colonial project in the Pacific that would itself generate a brutal insurgency and decades of controversy. For Spain, the disaster of 1898, known in Spanish history simply as El Disaster, was a national trauma of the deepest kind. The loss of the last remnants of empire at the hands of an upstart nation born from rebellion struck at the very heart of Spanish national identity. A generation of Spanish intellectuals known as the generation of 1898, figures like Miguel de Unamuno, Antonio Machado, Pío Baroja, and Ramiro de Maeztu, grappled with what the catastrophe meant for Spain's place in the modern world. Their writings, suffused with existential questioning and national soul-searching, produced some of the most remarkable literature in the Spanish language. The disaster forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about Spanish society, political corruption, military incompetence, and economic backwardness that reformers had long identified, but which only catastrophic defeat could bring into undeniable focus. The transatlantic relationship between Spain and the United States entered a long period of relative distance in the early 20th century. Spain remained neutral during World War I, navigating the conflict with difficulty while its economy suffered from disrupted trade. The United States, entering the war in 1917, had little need for Spanish diplomatic engagement. In the 1920s, economic modernization, particularly in Catalonia and the Basque Country, began to reshape Spanish society, but political instability continued. The Second Spanish Republic, proclaimed in 1931, attempted sweeping democratic reforms that polarized Spanish society to the breaking point. The Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939 placed the Spain-United States relationship under severe strain in ways that resonated across the Atlantic. When General Francisco Franco launched his nationalist uprising against the Republic, the conflict immediately attracted international attention. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy intervened on Franco's side, providing aircraft, troops, and weapons in what amounted to a rehearsal for World War II. The Soviet Union provided material support to the Republic. The United States government, bound by neutrality acts and determined to avoid entanglement in European conflicts, officially embargoed arms sales to both sides, a policy that in practice hurt the Republic, which desperately needed weapons, more than it hurt Franco, who was being supplied by the Axis powers. Yet American society was far from neutral in its sympathies. Approximately 2,800 Americans volunteered to fight for the Spanish Republic as members of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, men and women who crossed the Atlantic to defend democracy against fascism before their own country was willing to do so. Ernest Hemingway covered the war as a journalist and wrote, "For whom the bell tolls," from his experiences. American intellectuals, artists, and labor organizers rallied to the Republican cause. The Spanish Civil War became a defining moral and political cause for the American left in a way that reverberated for decades. Franco won, and Spain endured nearly 40 years of authoritarian rule. During World War II, despite pressure from Hitler, Franco kept Spain nominally neutral while providing significant covert assistance to the Axis, allowing German submarines to refuel in Spanish ports, sharing intelligence, and sending the División Azul of Spanish volunteers to fight alongside German forces on the Eastern Front. The United States viewed Franco's Spain with deep suspicion. After the war, Spain was initially excluded from the Marshall Plan and from the United Nations. Treated as a pariah state because of its wartime collaboration with fascism and its ongoing authoritarianism. But Cold War logic overrode democratic principle with remarkable speed. By the early 1950s, as the United States confronted the Soviet Union across a divided Europe, Franco's fierce anti-communism made him a strategically useful ally. In 1953, the United States and Spain signed the Pact of Madrid, a bilateral defense agreement that gave the United States the right to establish military bases in Spain in exchange for economic and military aid. American air bases at Torrejon, Zaragoza, and Moron, and a naval base at Rota became central to American strategic planning in Europe and the Mediterranean. Franco, who had been an international pariah, was rehabilitated as an American partner. Spain joined the United Nations in 1955. The democratic credentials of the arrangement were never discussed seriously. Strategic necessity trumped political values in the calculus of Cold War realism. Spain's democratic transition, the transition, following Franco's death in 1975, was one of the most remarkable political transformations of the 20th century. Under King Juan Carlos I and Prime Minister Adolfo Suarez, Spain dismantled the Franco estate, legalized political parties and trade unions, held free elections, and drafted a democratic constitution, all without the political violence that had torn Spain apart in the 1930s. The United States watched the transition with cautious support, concerned at certain moments about the strength of the Spanish Communist Party and about the possible destabilization of the country, but broadly in favor of Spain's democratization. Spain's entry into NATO in 1982 and into the European Community in 1986 completed its integration into the Western democratic order. The transatlantic relationship between Spain and the United States was, for the first time in history, grounded in shared democratic values rather than merely strategic convenience or imperial competition. In the post-Cold War era, Spanish-American relations have been shaped by cooperation and occasional friction. Spain played a significant role in American-led interventions in the Gulf War of 1991. Spanish diplomacy was active in the peace processes of Central America in the 1980s, where Spain's linguistic and cultural ties gave it influence the United States lacked. The September 11th attacks brought Spain firmly into the American-led coalition against al-Qaeda. But the 2003 invasion of Iraq, supported by Prime Minister José María Aznar in defiance of strong Spanish public opposition, produced a political earthquake. The Madrid train bombings of March 11, 2004, carried out by an al-Qaeda-inspired cell, killed 191 people and wounded nearly 2,000, just days before the Spanish general election. The incoming socialist government of José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero withdrew Spanish troops from Iraq, straining relations with Washington. The episode illustrated both the depth of the transatlantic relationship and the limits of alignment when domestic politics and public opinion diverge sharply from government policy. Today, Spain and the United States are allies within NATO, partners within the transatlantic community, and connected by deep cultural, linguistic, and human ties. The Spanish diaspora in the United States and the broader Latino community, shaped in large part by cultures rooted in the Spanish colonial world, numbers in the tens of millions. Spanish is the second most spoken language in the United States. The cultural and linguistic legacy of Spain's empire is embedded in American place names, legal traditions, architectural heritage, and demographic identity in ways that no political treaty could have created. The transatlantic relationship between Spain and the United States is, in the deepest sense, not merely diplomatic or strategic. It is civilizational. The story that began with Columbus's landfall in 1492 is still being written in two languages on both sides of the Atlantic.